I'm rolling, Bob.
Well, Michael Sheen, it is good to see you again. Last night we had the Q&A following the screening of The Queen, which was very, very well received. And I wanted to ask you last night, and we didn't get to it, but was there any physical alteration of you to play Tony Blair?
Well, I'd like to say that there was huge amounts of time in the makeup, but unfortunately there wasn't. I just, we did my hair, and that was it really. I think one of the things that we decided with the film generally was that we thought we'd do everything we could with people's hair and wigs and that kind of thing, but then makeup-wise, you know, we didn't want to add anything, we didn't want to stick anything on or use prosthetics or anything like that. So we would just sort of use very little makeup to try and you know, look like the character, because we didn't want people to be obsessing about that. We didn't want people to be worrying too much about whether we looked like these people. We just wanted them to believe in the characters and go on the journey with them. So we thought if there was too much alteration, then it would sort of, it would keep reminding people that we weren't actually the characters we were playing.
Probably then Helen Mirren, as Queen Elizabeth, had the most makeup or makeover.
Well, I mean, she had the wig and the glasses, but then after that, very little again. I mean, she used to do her makeup herself. So, you know, it shows that she didn't have that much, really. So it's more to do with, I suppose, trying to inhabit the character as much as you can. And you sort of create this sort of slightly morphing thing where you just, in trying to replicate the way these characters speak and the way that they express themselves, hopefully you start to look like the character without having to do too much makeup work.
When the writer, Peter Morgan, was getting the script together, what kind of research did he do, and who are some of the people he talked with?
Well, he spoke to as many people as he could, really. He's always meticulous about his research. And he always says that he's surprised by how many people want to speak to him about it. But of course, with a story like this, because there's basically 3 different palaces involved. You've got Buckingham Palace with the Queen's household, you've got Charles's household in his palace, and then you have Diana's household. And everyone wants to tell their side of the story because each story is very different. So I suppose they knew that Peter was talking to the other palaces, so they wanted to get their side of the story in as well. And then at Westminster, with 10 Downing Street and Tony Blair's people, Peter says he's always surprised by how much people want to spill the beans around there. People are always trying to leak stories and tell them information. So he got a lot of information. And he was, we had a royal advisor on the film as well. So there was a lot of people able to help out with all that kind of stuff.
Before you got into The Queen, what was your feeling about the monarchy?
Well, it's one of those things where you just grow up with it in Britain. You know, you're never aware. I'm never aware of a time, obviously, that where the monarchy haven't been there. But I'm also not aware of a time when Queen Elizabeth wasn't on the throne, because she was on the throne long before me. I mean, one of the things that I always think stands out in the film is when she says, when Queen Elizabeth says to Blair, "You are my 10th Prime Minister. Winston Churchill was my first." And you think, my goodness, you know, this woman was Queen when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister. So growing up, I know no different. And I think it'll be interesting when Queen Elizabeth is no longer on the throne, because I think most people's attitude towards the royal family is based on their attitude towards Queen Elizabeth, and there's such a huge amount of respect and affection for her in Britain. And maybe when she's no longer Queen, it might be a different proposition. You know, people might have a very different idea about what their opinion is about the royal family. But I came to it like everybody else, I suppose, in Britain, where you have your own sense. When you think about it intellectually, you think, well, maybe it is wrong that there's this one family who are very privileged and born into it. But then you think, well, they do an amazing job, really, and bring so much, you know, tourist money into the country. But I do think they're extraordinary ambassadors for our country, and certainly the Queen is. So I came into it sort of pro the people, but maybe slightly anti the institution, I suppose. And it's interesting that with this film, Stephen Frears, the director, and Peter Morgan, the writer, I suppose would be, if anything, anti-royalists. And yet, the artistic side of them can't help but make everybody very human and three-dimensional in the film. And so the film comes out, I think, probably very sympathetic towards them.
Tony Blair has one speech in the film that really defends the Queen and just gives, it's a Valentine to the Queen.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in some ways Blair in this film is the audience representative. in that the journey for the audience in terms of their relationship with the Queen and how they feel about her mirrors Tony Blair's journey. When he first comes in as Prime Minister and meets her for the first time, she seems quite a cold, remote, quite intimidating figure, very austere. And then as the film progresses, he can't understand why she's reacting the way she is over the death of Diana and wanting to keep everything very small and not show any feelings to the people. And then slowly as the film goes on, he starts to empathize as he learns more and more about her and the context that she lives within and how she's grown up. He starts to empathize more with that. And of course, there are only two real leaders in Britain, and one is the Prime Minister and one is the Queen. And so there's a certain empathy that happens there between them anyway. And I think when he voices his defense of the Queen, when Alistair Campbell, his sort of chief spin doctor, starts making these cruel jibes at her, I think he's voicing what hopefully the audience is feeling by that point as well, that this woman has done a fantastic job. She never chose to have this job. It was brought upon her. She watched her father die because of the pressures and the stress of it, and then this woman, i.e. Diana, comes along and starts, in her eyes, to take away everything that she holds most dear. And so it was a great moment for me in the film, because I got to be able to really express something. Because all the way through the film up until that point, Blair has quite a sort of subterranean journey through it. It's like all the important events for him are happening off screen, and he keeps being brought back to this niggling problem of how to deal with Diana's funeral. And then eventually he realizes that it's become a huge crisis and he has to turn his attention to it. So it was nice to, for one moment in the film, to suddenly burst out with how he feels about the situation. And I think it's sort of quite surprising in the film.
Did your attitudes or feelings about Tony Blair change any after you played him?
Well, I played him first about 4 years ago in a program called The Deal that we did for British TV, which was about the early career of Blair before it finished with him becoming leader of the Labour Party. And so I did a lot of research about him then. And ever since then, whenever I see him on the TV, which he is a lot, obviously, or hear him on the radio, my first instinctive reaction is a mixture of that's me and that's a very close family member. It's sort of like he's become part of my family now, really. Because when you play a character, it doesn't matter whether they're a fictional character or a real-life character. Part of the process for an actor is that you have to try and understand why they do what they do. And in understanding someone, you can't help but empathise and then sort of love them, really, and have a great deal of affection for them, and very protective of them. So it's quite a curious schizophrenic feeling playing someone like Blair, who is constantly being lambasted in the press and the media and by the public in Britain at the moment. And I feel like it's a personal threat to myself somehow, and yet my own beliefs and opinions about political choices are very different. I have to try and keep them very separate. But it's a very peculiar feeling, having played someone who you see in the contemporary media all the time.
If you could talk with Tony Blair and spend 10, 15 minutes with him even, what would you like to ask him?
Gracious me, that's a very difficult question to answer. Well, I suppose there's a very great divide in opinion of Tony Blair as a person, and this is sort of throughout his whole career, is as to whether he is a sort of ruthlessly ambitious careerist, a great opportunist, someone who has no real central belief system and who is very much about finding out what people want and trying to make it look like he's giving it to them. There's all that side of the way of looking at him. And then on the other side, there's the opinion that he is a man who has a very, very strong central belief system that based on his religion, his Christianity, and his own sort of moral and ethical sense. And that his attitude towards his career has been quite a fluid one, and that he has always done what he thinks is best for his party, but in the long term, what he thinks is best for the country. And that he is someone who really does want to change things for the better. And that it's just been that at certain points through his career, he just happens to be the right person in the right place at the right time. So I don't know if there's one single question that I'd like to ask him in a way, because I don't know how you could try and get an answer to that, to find out what is the truth. I suspect the truth is somewhere in between, in the middle. But I would love to be able to spend a good hour with him and just have a conversation. And I think my actor's instinct hopefully would kick in, and I'd be able to tell what really motivates him in there. But I'd be fascinated to do that. Maybe in about another 20 years' time we'll sit down together. Because hopefully we'll do another film again. I mean, like I say, the deal was about his early career. The Queen follows the period of time when he's at his most popular. And hopefully in years to come we'll do another film about the unpopular days, the wilderness years, and towards the end of his premiership. So that would be interesting, eventually, after all that is done, to be able to sit down and talk to him.
Would you dare to ask him what he thinks about your portrayal of him?
I would, I'm sure he would let me know if we ever actually talked about it. I hope that he would be flattered. I think in The Queen, he comes out of it very sympathetically. Again, it's when he was at his most popular. It's 4 months into his leadership. And he was never more popular, I suppose, than after he made the famous People's Princess speech. Whereas in The Deal, that was a bit more controversial, not as sympathetic. He was a much more sort of shadowy character in that. And I hope that if there is a third film, that we'd be able to somehow, sort of put what he's done and the choices he's made into a context that makes it more understandable for people, I hope. So I hope that he'd be flattered. Who knows? We don't know.
If you could talk with the Queen, what would you like to ask her?
My goodness, I don't know if I could ask her anything. I'd just sit there in awe, I think.
It's not proper, is it, to ask a
No,
question?
I don't think you're not really, encouraged to ask questions of the Queen. You tend to let her ask you questions, and then you answer. And when she thinks that it's time for the conversation to be over, she shakes your hand and just moves you to the side. And I've had that because I did meet her once.
Oh, you did? What was
Yes,
the occasion?
yes. At my drama school, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, she makes a visit every now and again. And as a sort of a past graduate of the college, I was sort of put on display along with other people, and she came down the line and said hello to us all. I always think it's funny to think that, I remember someone saying once that the Queen must think that the whole world smells of fresh paint, because everywhere she goes it's just been painted before she gets.
I was hoping you'd say fresh flowers, because
it's probably a mixture of the two, yeah.
Victor, hang on just a second. It's a job. I would not want her job.
Oh.
I would not.
Can you imagine? It's the same for them both. I mean, both jobs pretty much entail just having to meet people constantly, and just say hello and how are you, and be interested in them, and know what they're doing. It must be horrendous.
When Princess Diana was killed, what were your feelings about it? Did you share any of the kind of negative feelings that some people had toward the monarchy?
Well, I mean, in the, I think it was a Sunday morning when we woke up and found out what had happened in Paris in the early hours of the morning. The first reaction was just a huge shock. And when someone who is that famous and that familiar and that much of a sort of cultural icon as Diana was, it's just a huge shock. And then in the subsequent days that followed, I just remember, first of all, I remember being very upset about the idea of these two boys, Harry and William, who were left behind. I mean, apart from anything else, it was, you hear about a mother who's been killed and she's got two boys. It's just heartbreaking. And then I remember being sort of slightly mystified at the extent of the outpouring of grief that happened just amongst people in Britain. I remember there was sort of, at the time, there were two ways of thinking about it, two attitudes towards it. One, which was, I'm sure the majority, which was just people just unable to stop crying and being so overwhelmed by it. And then there was another camp, I suppose, who were aware that there was a cultural phenomenon happening that nobody really understood, and there were a lot of theories about it. So at the time, I seem to remember, in terms of the royal family, we were all a bit mystified, really, as to why they seemed so remote. And it's only through doing the film that I've realized, why that might have been, and that it's been put into a context that allows, I think, myself and I hope other people to understand why they reacted the way they did. In that, I think the death of Diana allowed us as a society in Britain to realize that there'd been a huge cultural shift, and without us necessarily being aware of it. And it was only through the death of Diana that it crystallized what that shift was and what she represented, in that you have the royal family who symbolic of tradition and duty and responsibility and a particular code of doing things, and that there's a way of reacting to every situation, and that's the way you do it, and that's it. And you maintain a dignified silence and a stiff upper lip, all those things that Britain as a nation stereotypically is known for. Well, they all come from somewhere. They're cliches because they're true, or they have been true at some point, and the royal family sort of embody that. Tony Blair's new Labour government, who just got into power, represent a completely different kind of Britain. It's all about taking the pulse of the nation and taking. Okay.
Right. So do you kind of remember where you were?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, and then you have Tony Blair and the new Labour government, who represent a completely different kind of Britain. Very much based on the Clinton administration and the Clinton election campaign, because Blair and Brown both came over here and worked with them a lot. And so it's very much about taking polls and finding out what people want and trying to give it to them, and being much more sort of informal and touchy-feely and all that, and being much more showing how you feel and talking about your emotions and all that kind of stuff. And so then you have completely diametrically opposed worlds there, and one represents the old Britain, one represents the new Britain, I suppose. And in between, I think you have Diana, who bridged both of those worlds. She came from the royal family, she was part of that institution, but she sort of rebelled against it. It didn't sit well on her shoulders, and she started to become much more of a part of the celebrity culture, much more part of the confessional culture that we've sort of started to have now. And so, of course, when she created the bridge between those two worlds, and then when she was taken out of the equation, those two worlds just slammed together. And that's what we have in the film. That's what we see in the film. And you've got the royals who were totally unaware that this cultural shift has happened. And then you have Blair, who's so much part of the modern order that he can't understand why they're doing what they're doing. And so that's the interesting thing about the film. I think it points up a moment in our British culture where there was a huge shift that had been happening for quite a long time, but that was the moment that it was crystallized.
There is so much humor in The Queen.
Mm.
And when Peter Morgan was writing it, Stephen Frears directing, all of you acting in it, was there a thought that are we making a mockery? Are we making fun of? Or did you discuss the humor aspect?
Absolutely. It's a very fine line, I think, and it's a line that I think Peter Morgan as a writer walks on very, very well. I don't think it ever exploits anyone or laughs at anyone. He finds a way to release the humor in situations without ever belittling anyone, I feel. And if anything, he's cheeky. I think that's where it is. That's the one quality I think about him, is that he's able to write things in certain ways that you think, we can't get away with this. Even though you don't feel that you're mocking them, you just think, how you can't have the Duke of Edinburgh getting into bed with Queen Elizabeth and saying, move over cabbage, as he does. You just think it's cheap, and yet it seems to work. He seems to be able to get away with it. And the big thing about Stephen Frears, I think, with this film, is his big challenge was to find the right tone, the tone for the film that would allow all this the stuff that we have in it to work for an audience. If you get the tone wrong, then suddenly it could seem like you're mocking people, so it's a real balancing act. And I remember when we were filming, every now and again we'd do a scene, and then Stephen would come from behind the camera and say, he'd just be sort of chuckling away to himself, going, I can't believe we're doing this. I can't believe it. We're all going to be beheaded, he kept saying. But I think it's with a warmth, and it's with a humanity, and it's never at the expense of anyone, I don't think.
Well, Michael, I could go on talking with you for hours,
yeah.
but our time doesn't permit that. I do thank you so much for being generous with your time and your talent. And I feel that this movie is, I know it's already a critical success, and I think that the word-of-mouth audiences are just going to flock to see it.
Oh, I hope so.
And, well, we won't talk about awards.
No, we don't talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bobbie. Thank you. And Caitlin, his wife, as well. They're just this mad couple. So it'll be really exciting.
Okay, so, okay. And if you'll just start to answer for a few
Sure.
words, and then you can stop, or I'll wave you off.
Okay.
What is your take on Tony Blair? What kind of man do you think he is?
Well, I think he's a mixture of things, really. I think on the one hand...
That's good. That's good. Okay. After doing this movie, do you have a different... after doing The Queen, do you have a different feeling about the monarchy?
I think you inevitably end up sympathizing more with their situation after.
At the time of Diana's death, what were your feelings? Were they negative, as some of the British people had?
I remember just being shocked, like everybody else, really, at the time.
I'm going to re-ask that a different
Okay.
way. At the time of Diana's death, did you have any negative feelings towards the monarchy?
Well, first of all, the first reaction, I think, was just complete shock and being stunned by what had happened.
Okay. If you could talk, if you could speak with Tony Blair, what would you ask him?
I would, well, I don't have to ask him what he wears in bed, because I know that now after talking to his daughter.
Would you dare to ask Tony Blair, if you had the opportunity, what he thinks about your portrayal?
Well, I hope that he would be flattered. I don't know if I could out and out ask him that. I think I'd wait for him to tell me how much better looking I am than him, how much more charismatic I am than him.
Okay. There's a good bit of humor in this, and at the time when Peter Morgan was writing the script, Stephen Frears was directing. Did you all discuss playing the humor in it?
Well, it's, I think one of the qualities that Peter has in his writing is this sort of cheekiness. And it's a fine line, it's a fine sort of tightrope walk that you have to do with that kind of thing.
That's good. Okay. Did you have to have any sort of physical makeover to play Blair?
I would like to say that I did. I would like to say I had huge amounts of makeup on to make me look older, but I didn't, unfortunately. It was just a hairstyle and then a bit of makeup and off into the fray.
Helen Mirren, though, had to have some makeup, didn't she?
Well, she has the wig, obviously, and the glasses and all that kind of stuff. But she did her makeup herself, so you know it wasn't that extensive, really. It's more about trying to just inhabit the character.
Did you ever meet the Queen?
I did meet her once at my old drama school, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and I was hoping she would knight me, but unfortunately she passed over me that time, but maybe one day.
Okay, that should take care of it.